Proverbs chapter 19. We're going to be in 19 and 20 this morning as we continue through the practical Proverbs for everyday life, looking at the things in the book of Proverbs that strike our hearts and that draw our attention and that force us to think very practically about our lives. I want to start our class this morning by pointing out just two Proverbs this morning from our reading, our study in 19 through 20. A couple of questions that the Father asks in Proverbs chapter 20 and verse number 9 and Proverbs chapter 20 and verse 24. I'll put them up here on the screen behind me so that we can think about them together. The wise man asks these questions. Who can say, I have made my heart pure? I am clean from sin. And then in verse number 24, he says, a man's steps are from the Lord. How then can a man understand his way? Now, I'll tell you, taken by themselves, these Proverbs aren't really optimistic, are they? They kind of expose some realities about us. A certain futility that we face, right? Who can say I'm pure? Who can say I'm clean from my sin? That's rhetorical because we all know there's not a single person in this world, is there, that can say those things. I think we know deep down we are not perfect. You know, it's interesting. I talk to a lot of people, and it's very interesting the language people use, how they try to excuse away their insecurities, their insufficiencies. Even religious people will make comments like, well, we're all just sinners, and God knows that about me. And I think it's important, to acknowledge those things. But I think it exposes this sense that we all have. We know that, right? We kind of get this feeling like we're lacking in something. We can't understand our way. And again, that's a pretty hopeless picture, isn't it? Just kind of taken by itself. But given the nature of the Proverbs that we're studying, it's obvious that the right way can be learned, right? That's something that we talk about over and over again. The way of wisdom, it's crying out to us. We can learn the way of wisdom. We can walk in the way of wisdom. In fact, we're given a solution to this problem in chapter 19 and verse number 21, when he says, many are the plans in the mind of a man, but it is the purpose of the Lord that will stand. But I want you to look at these two questions. Do you see what the Father is doing by asking us these rhetorical questions? He's forcing us to face realities we know, but that we don't like to acknowledge. Nobody likes to say, I can't do that. I'm incapable of doing that. I can't figure it out myself, especially men, right? We like to have that sense of, I can do this, I can fix this. But I think this is true for everyone. But what I think this also teaches and reminds us is that the way of wisdom is a way of honesty and a way of transparency. Right? We've got to expose ourselves for who we truly are. We've got to see our insufficiencies because fools are the ones that live in the shadows. That's kind of what we keep seeing here in the book of Proverbs. Fools are the ones that, you can't be talking about me. They refuse the instruction. They refuse the admonition. They refuse any sort of rebuke. They hide their faults and their failures with this facade of pride and competency or even apathy. I don't really care. And that will deal with the issue for a moment, won't it? I mean, I'm sure we've all done that at some point in our lives to some extent, right? We know our failings and we kind of salve our consciences towards those things. But you also know that doesn't bring peace with reality, does it? It doesn't bring peace with the realities about ourselves, the realities about the end of our life and our eternal existence. And as Paul would remind us in Romans chapter 3, as he's setting up the gospel, the good news, he would say, none is righteous. No, not one. No one seeks after God. I think I hear echoes of this in Paul time and time again. And we don't need to just learn these truths. We need to be real about our failings and our need to change. And I can't do that on my own, and neither can you. Isn't that kind of what this says here? How can a man understand his way? A man's steps are from God. We need to be taught these things. Unless you have that sort of awareness, your pride's going to take over. It's going to create these walls of self-reliance that are very dangerous. It's dangerous. It's not just foolish, it's dangerous. Wisdom teaches us to be confident in the light rather than cowering in the darkness. Because, fear finds power when we don't get invasive with our lives. Because, again, deep inside of us, we know we are not who we should be. And so the question we must ask, if we're going to walk in the way of wisdom, is, am I willing to expose those realities? Let God expose those realities. and let God change me. Now, you guys know that's easier said than done, right? But that's the way of wisdom, and that's what we're trying to accomplish in this class today. So I just wanted to start with these because these are very exposing, aren't they? There's none of us that can say, I'm pure. I am clean from my sin on our own. But thanks be to God, by the blood of Jesus, we can be cleansed by walking in the way of wisdom. Nick, did you have some thoughts you wanted to tack onto that?
John Clark used to say that sin was something that you do that I don't like to do. And
okay.
We frequently look at other people and critically and ourselves way too easy.
Yeah, that's exactly right. The gospel forces us to rip off the Band-Aid and look at the reality of who we are. That's right. We were dead in our trespasses and sins, but God has made us alive together with Christ. It's an important and critical contrast and reality we must live with. Any other thoughts or comments about these verses? Yeah, go ahead, Jim.
So I'm going to just give me some clarity of what you're saying.
Sure.
Philippians, he says, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me.
Sure.
So there's 1 Corinthians 9, there's no excuse. There's a way of escape. Right?
Sure.
I think he's saying here, we all have strongholds and we all fight this battle.
That's right.
But so there's no excuse, right?
That's right.
The issue with us is we have to, I know when you sin, you quickly say, it's wrong, I'm going to do better, right? And somebody says, well, he did it again, though. Yeah.
Yeah.
True. I'm just trying to understand what you're saying. No doubt, we all are sinners. We all fail, and we're going to fail. If we say we're not going to fail, we're probably liars. But there's still no excuse.
That's right.
And because of the blood of Christ, right, because we repent, because we're serious about it, God forgives us. Could you just clarify that?
Yeah, for sure. So let me just, I think what you need to hear from me is, I'm not trying to commiserate about this, right? I'm not just trying to say, hey, we're all sinners and we can't figure it out. I think this creates the need for Christ, right? This is what, and you think about this too. These Proverbs were written under the Old Covenant, the Old Law. There wasn't clarity about Jesus. There wasn't clarity about how we could even overcome these things. And in some ways, as he's writing this, he's going, there is no way that I can do this. I got nothing that I can do. And that's why when we get to the New Testament, Paul's able to say, but thanks be to God who gives us the victory, right? There's that need that's created through all of this, that's universal, that we all are subject to, right? And that's where the gospel has to start. And that's where we see Jesus clearly. I think, is that your point?
How did he see the Redeemer so clearly? I don't understand how he saw him. Before he came, I know there was always a promise of him. We can see him, like we see him clearly, but they did. How did they live a life that was right with God, that was full of sin and brokenness, but they never quit without really seeing the Savior?
Well, I think isn't that kind of what Hebrews 11 speaks to? You know, they were looking for a city whose founder and builder was God. I mean, they were given certain promises and truths, and I think that's what he's hoping for. But in this context, in this moment, he didn't have that clarity about how it would play out. I mean, that's the mystery, right? That's the mystery that was fulfilled in Christ.
Well, they had such clarity about the city that they were going to, or the country they were going to, and they were so confused about it.
That's right. That's right.
Do we see that clearly? I mean, do we see this country that we're going to?
Yeah. Well, these are the kinds of things that have to kind of push us towards that clarity, right? We don't get that unless we understand the great need that we have. Danny?
Yeah, surely God could write a book that we could understand.
Sure.
If he can create the world, he can do that. But this says, can a man understand man's way? No.
Yeah.
If we were trying to get to heaven by ourselves, we'd all be lost.
That's exactly right. Man plans his ways, but God directs his steps. Proverbs 16 and verse 9. Joel talked about that last Wednesday. Some good thoughts there. John?
When you were opening with these two, it brought my mind to verse 3 of chapter 19, when it talks about when a man's folly brings his way to ruin, his heart rages against the Lord. We blame God when our failure is something that we've done. We act foolishly, things go awry, we won't blame God.
Yeah.
Instead of looking at things with realistic eyes and saying, I need to change.
Yeah, that's a great thought. Verse 3, that one was one that jumped out at me because it's revealing this fact that we can get so caught up in our ways that we actually blame God for our own choices, for our own way of thinking, for our own logic. And we've seen people do this, right? Like, this all made sense to me. God, why isn't it not working, right? That's kind of what this sounds like. How could you let this happen, God? I don't understand. That's backwards thinking. That's my way, putting God into my way, as opposed to walking God's way and massaging my way with that. Yeah, good thoughts about that. Anything else about these verses? Yeah, go ahead, Kelly.
I noticed these, especially, it sounded like a present king speaking to a future king about how to conduct himself in a place of authority. Solomon's kid was Jeroboam, right?
Rehoboam.
Rehoboam,
Yeah.
right? So
He's the remix. That's how you remember Rehoboam. Rehoboam. Yeah.
nice.
Yeah, there you go.
So I see a whole lot in here about how to conduct yourself in authority with justice and fairness, and how to conduct yourself as the head of an organization, maybe the head of a family, and it can be applied all the way down.
Okay, so you see a common theme kind of running through this week about leadership. It sounds like you're talking about not just being a king, but leadership just in the family. And was there a specific verse in regards to that stuck out to you?
Well, the repeat about the weights and measures and how you need to be just about handling things. The fact that he talks about king quite a bit, mentions it with the lowercase k. So
sure.
He's not talking about. Just basically, I saw that theme.
Sure, yeah. In fact, it's interesting you bring that up because I've noticed that the past several weeks there's been a lot written to the king about how the king ought to be. Some of them are written in maxims as though, like, this is what the ideal king looks like. And then there's others where it's warning the subjects. For instance, chapter 19 and verse number 12, a king's wrath is like the growling of a lion, but his favor like the dew. He has a responsibility and a place, and his subjects need to understand and appreciate that right and that responsibility that he has. Good thoughts there. Linda, do you have something in that regard?
Apparently I misread 24.
Okay.
Because I read it as, a man's steps are from the Lord. How then can man understand his way? Meaning God's way.
Okay.
Is how I read it.
Okay.
Apparently I read it wrong.
Man's steps are from the Lord, how then can he understand his? So you think the his at the end of that sentence is a reference to God's way?
It could have been. We don't understand what God has in store for us.
Okay.
I'm not saying I'm right. I'm just saying
Sure.
I read it totally differently. So I'm just like.
Yeah, I'd be interested to go back and see what the original language, what part of speech that is, if it's referring to God or if it's referring to ours. But I think certainly there could be some value in what you're saying. We can understand God's ways. His ways are higher than our ways, beyond our ways.
Yeah, I think I just misread it.
Okay.
But anyway.
Okay.
If you look at the versions that actually capitalize the divinity pronouns,
Okay.
it's not.
Okay.
So
Okay.
that's bad.
Okay.
And then the beauty of the scriptures, though, is that we can read them even incorrectly sometimes and still come away with a life-changing message to us. So I got no problem in reading it.
An old problem in reading. Here we go. Miss Ruth.
I guess I'm reading from the Old King James,
Okay.
and it says, how can a man then understand his own way?
Okay.
So I don't know if, but it seems that in reading this, how can I understand my own way? It's
Sure.
like I'm floundering.
Yeah.
God.
Okay. Yeah, there's some floundering to that. Okay. I appreciate the way you said that. John?
Got a cross-reference back to chapter 16 and verse 9. The mind of man plans his way, but the Lord directs his steps.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so that whole section, chapter 16, 1 through 9, I think gives us some clarity to that about how we think we have a way that makes sense, and we make our plans. And it never says that that's a bad thing, right? But it's trying to help us understand. You make plans thoughtless of God, thoughtless of the wisdom and the instruction that He's giving, well, you're going to end up somewhere foolish. You're going to flounder. I think we've all experienced that, haven't we, in a very practical way? We go the way that seems best of us, and then we end up in this place and we go, well, how'd I end up here? And why are things not the way I thought they were going to be? That's exposing us, right? It's helping us realize maybe we're not on God's way. Maybe we're on a different way, and we need to have that sort of awareness. Kent?
Well,
I have a lot of experience doing that.
Okay. Same, all right.
And even religiously.
Okay.
Because I spent a lot of my life trying to do religion by my own strength. Basically, I tried to do spiritual things with the strength of the flesh.
Sure.
And so I reduced it down to intellect and information and willpower, reading comprehension, and more grit, more try harder. And what the result that I found, we talked about earlier that we all still struggle with sin, was I just got deeper and deeper into my sin. And the harder I tried, the worse it got. What I found is that whole mentality was very backwards. And I guess my revelation was that I used to believe that, well, I can do the right things, I just have to try harder to do them. And if I couldn't, then God's a cruel God, because why would he tell me to do things I can't do? And then I finally realized that I can't do it apart from his Spirit. And I have to be dependent on him. I have to surrender my pride. All of that has to be surrendered and let him work in me. And any time that I lose sight of that, I'm going to struggle and fall.
Sure.
And so for me, it's really kind of learning to be spiritual.
Sure. Yeah.
And there should be growth. So yes, I still struggle with sin even now, but I should see a growth trajectory in my walk with Christ.
Yeah.
With Christ. If I don't see that, then I need to do some very serious reflection.
Yeah, well, and to that point, it has less to do with the specific activities, because I think from the flesh perspective and from the spirit perspective, a lot of those activities are going to be the same. It's which spirit am I submitting to, right?
Where's my trust? Is it in myself, in my effort, or is it in Jesus and the Spirit?
But to the point of these verses, that comes from listening and allowing yourself to be instructed. And I think that points back to Jim's point. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me, right? Christ strengthening me is not he's going to come pick me up and force me to do anything. It's he's instructed me and I'm walking with him. I walk with him in obedience, right? And I know obedience sounds very rote sometimes, but that's where the trust is demonstrated, right? I trust him. Why would I not walk with him, obey him, do what he says? That makes perfect sense, right? And that's the spirit that we listen to. It's a choice of who we listen to. Yeah, great thoughts. I appreciate that. Okay, Jim?
Well, I think when we do that we're really going to serve him, then Satan becomes even worse on us. And, Romans 17 speaks of that. It's when I want to really do well, sin lies close to my hand.
Sure.
I think for me, is Scripture clearly says, put on the whole armor of God, and all has to do with just think about the whole armor of God and how we're protecting ourselves. But the truth is, it is very difficult, and most of our battle is a stronghold that's in our own mind.
Sure.
He said, I can break down that stronghold.
Yeah. But it starts with the realization that I can't, right? That's what these Proverbs do. I can't. I cannot be victorious. I cannot win. Yeah. Okay, what else from Proverbs? What provoked your heart this week in the book of Proverbs? Not everybody all at once, please. Please, y'all call Miss Judy.
1917 talks about having pity on the poor.
Okay.
And that led me to, in the New Testament, how many times we're told that how we treat our fellow man is very important to our salvation.
Yeah. That's an interesting way to phrase that. How we treat the poor is important to our salvation, right? Do you guys believe that? How we behave towards those who have less? I think, this proverb, it reveals to us some of the nature of God, doesn't it? He cares about the poor. I mean, I think we've referenced in this class several times how often in the Old Covenant he would say, hey, you need to make sure you take care of the poor, have something to give to them, be mindful of them, because you were poor and you were needy and you were a stranger and you were a sojourner and God saw you. If we're becoming more like God, it's critical that we care about the poor, and that's part of our responsibility, isn't it? Yeah, that's great thoughts, Judy. Kurt?
I just think it's interesting that she brought that up, because that's really the one passage that I've highlighted. All these passages in these two chapters were really good, but this one about being generous to the poor is one I think it hits home for me, just because I've seen in other countries just really severe poverty, and I know you probably have as well in your travels.
That's right.
just this notion of lending to the Lord and Him being willing to pay you for that good deed is encouraging. But it's a topic that I don't think we discuss enough in the churches, is taking care of the needs before.
Yeah. It's more than just philanthropy. We're trying to represent God in a proper way. And giving to the poor is something that God cares very deeply about. I was thinking about some of the Proverbs that we read earlier in Proverbs chapter 11, verses 24 through 26. It just talks about some of the practical realities of giving. One gives freely, it grows all the richer. Another withholds what he should give and only suffers want. Whoever brings blessing will be enriched, and one who waters will himself be watered. The people curse him who holds back grain, but a blessing is on the head of him who sells it. Those are some kind of practical outcomes that we've seen play out, right? That don't make a lot of sense except for the fact that it proves that God blesses those who submit to this and realize this is God's nature to give. And when you give, because the more you give, it would seem like the more I give, the less I'm going to have, right? That's the mentality that we live with. And that's why it's such a contrast, like a bizarre contrast for us. Because the more I give, I should have less, right? But we've all seen people, right, that give and give and give, and they never have want, right? And maybe it's not physical wants. Maybe they have. It's all spiritual, but the point being, God blesses this sort of attitude because it comes from His very nature. John?
Jesus taught on this in Matthew 25, for I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, you gave me a drink. I was a stranger, you invited me in. Naked, you clothed me. I was sick and you visited me. I was in prison and you came to me. And, the people asked him, what are you talking about? When did we do that?
Yeah.
And he said, when you did it to the least of my brothers.
Yeah. Well, and you notice in that passage and also in this passage that we're looking at, it's not about quantity, it's about quality, right? It's about the quality of the giving. Whoever is generous, right? Generous. That's how we ought to be giving. We ought to have a heart and that's why when you get into the New Testament, for instance, when it talks about our giving, it doesn't say you need to give 10%, right? It doesn't tell us you have to tithe. What does it say? As you've purposed in your heart, right? Because the Lord loves a cheerful giver, right? How do you think about your giving? Do you see it as something that connects to your salvation, as something that God wants us to do, that's from the nature of God, that is a reflection of our understanding of what we have been given? Or is it just, okay, I put my money in the plate this week, I gave some people some stuff? How do you think about your giving? It's not about the quantity. You don't have to be rich to be generous. Think about that. He doesn't say anything about how much money this person has. He just says whoever's generous to the poor lends to the Lord and He will repay him. Miss Ruth?
I was just wondering if he's maybe talking about more than just the monetary poor.
Okay.
In the old law, God tells the people how we should treat those who can't help themselves. More than just does he just have lack of food? It's more than that. It's those who either mentally or physically cannot help themselves.
That's a great thought. It's interesting. While you were saying that, it's interesting to me. In our Western affluent society especially, we tend to gravitate towards thinking about this from a money perspective, don't we? Right? A generous person is someone who gives money, right? That's how we tend to naturally think about it seems. But to Ruth's point, perhaps he has something broader in scope. I was thinking about James chapter 2 when you were saying that. I haven't studied this passage recently, but I was just thinking about, he talks about if this poor man comes into your assembly and a rich man comes into your assembly, don't treat them differently. Like, this is about having regard for humanity and realizing you give your time and your efforts and your energies the same to both people. That's what it means to be generous, right? Don't show partiality to those people just based on their current financial condition. Show them generosity the same, equally, because that's how God, right? God shows no partiality in how He treats people. John?
The word that's used in the New American Standard is gracious, and it's also used in chapter 14. happy is he who is gracious to the poor, in verse 21 of chapter 4.
Yeah.
I think that, to me, what Ruth is saying, more than just being generous with your money or food or whatever, but how do you treat them?
Yeah, it's literally an act of grace. You know, that the root word I just looked at, the root word that he uses there comes back to the idea of God showing favor. It's that word that's used in Genesis chapter 6. The Lord, Noah found grace or favor in the eyes of the Lord. That's the same idea. We're looking at others with the same sort of grace and favor that's undeserved, and that's life-giving. Michael?
I think what was fundamental in both the old law and the new law was, rewind. God said the second commandment is like the first. Jesus wrote, love your neighbor as yourself. What was fundamental in the old law was taking care of the most disadvantaged in society, widows and orphans. Why? We tend to, have like a more modern definition of orphan, someone who doesn't have parents. The old definition culturally that they would be using would be one that didn't have a father. The father was the sole provider, period. So if a widow or an orphan, someone who did not have a father, was in that situation, they were the most disadvantaged in society.
Sure.
Because they had no means of providing. So what did that do? Well, the widow will sell herself, sell a child into slavery, sell herself into slavery. I mean, all these really terrible outcomes. And so God's law and God's wisdom was take care of the disadvantaged in your society. And the same thing holds true today. Take care of the disadvantaged. And I've been thinking about this a lot, is we give out of our excess. If I have that which is left over, I will then dedicate that to charity, to God's will.
Sure.
Whereas I think the example we see is, no, my expectation for you, my followers, is that you give, trust that I'll take care of.
Yeah. Given abundance, given generosity. I'll get you in just a second, but let me just ask this question. So I'm just thinking about, we understand the principle at work here, right? There are people in need, and God sees people in need. Why is that such a challenge for us? Why is that such a challenge for humanity? Why does God feel it necessary to say, hey, you need to make sure you do this? Because in my experience, the reality is poor people tend to be overlooked. The helpless in society, they tend to be less the objects of receiving than perhaps others. Why do we struggle with that? Why is that the case? Jim?
We're quick to judge. When someone's begging for bread, we just say, well, they're a con artist. We are quick to judge instead of being very quick to be generous and honor someone. Now, why we're that way? Because we're raised in a society that says you just do it by bootstraps or whatever. And you know what? That's not how we're supposed to be at all. It's hard for me to go by anybody and not help them. There are times I think, maybe I shouldn't, but it's just, except for the grace of God, I could be there. I think we just have to have a different opinion.
Yeah. Well, and the reality is, most people in those kinds of circumstances, when we have and they don't have, we look at that somewhere in our minds, we say they have nothing to offer me. And that impacts us, doesn't it? I'm not saying that's right. Please don't hear me say, I'm not saying that's right. But I think that's what motivates a lot. We don't, and that's the James 2 principle, right? We look at the rich man and the poor man that come into the assembly, and for some reason people gravitate towards the rich man because he's got a lot to offer. And the poor person does not necessarily have as much to offer. Go ahead.
I was listening to a really good song this week. I'm forgetting the name, but it's by Keith and Chris getting it. And the lyric was, it's not what you give, it's what you keep. And it just really struck me because I was thinking back to the early church, how the Christians, they gave what they had so that no one was in need.
That's right.
And it was really convicting.
Yeah, I think about the Christians in 2 Corinthians 8 and 9, the Macedonians, where Paul commends them. He said, you gave, and you gave beyond what you were even able for the joy of sharing in this grace, because they understood grace so intensely that they realized, like, this stuff is not God's grace. This stuff is just, things for me to express God's grace to others and to recognize God even gives thought to me. And to Jim's point, we don't think about our stuff that way, do we? Maybe I'm speaking for myself more than you, but I don't often think about my stuff in that way. We've been given so that we can give. That's a phrase I've been trying to share with my kids. We've been given so that we can give. We have so we can share. And that's easier said than done. That's a practice we really have to work on. No?
I think a lot of it is, again, based on our culture, especially Western culture. But there's so much within us. I mean, there's greed that can cause that, but I think two major things is that sometimes we think of somebody else will take care
Somebody else, yeah.
And the other thing, because the other person has more than I do, that's sort of, status. The other thing is sometimes we look at the person and judge them whether they're worthy of us giving them something or helping them out. And sometimes we judge them the wrong way.
Yeah.
And that hits us pretty hard when all of a sudden we find out later that person really needed our help. It wasn't just begging.
You know what you said brought me back to Proverbs 19 and verse 17 that we're thinking about. That first word, he says, whoever is generous. This is a universal expectation, right? Anybody can be generous. Anybody can practice this. This is not limited to just those who have more than enough to give. It's everyone. And perhaps God expects everyone to practice this. Kelly?
Sometimes I feel convicted, and other times I feel like I'm too inwardly focused with my Christianity.
Okay.
It's more about me. How's it affecting me? How's my sanctification going? How's that going? It's almost like vanity.
Sure.
And I need to strive to be more outwardly focused and not so self-centric about it. Give it. Shine the light. Don't.
So isn't that really what this is about? It's about getting outside of ourselves, right? It's about learning to live with more than just how am I doing? Because God so loved the world that he gave, right? He looked outside of himself and he says, this is how you ought to be. This is how I designed you in my image to be, to look outside yourself. And to realize life is more than just what you get, it's what you give. It's probably why they write songs about it, right? It's not what you get, it's what you give. Miss Donna?
Y'all are probably gonna laugh at me, and it's not meant to be funny, but do not let the left hand know what the right hand is doing, or is it the other way because I'm left-handed?
Sure.
But we don't give according to, we give according to, well, I can't explain it. Do you understand what I'm saying though? It's that we don't consider ourselves, don't let this hand know what this hand is doing. Do it, but don't be prideful, don't be humble about it.
Sure.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, and again, I think it points back to the idea, we have to understand being able to give is a grace in and of itself, right, from God. The fact that we have something to give. God gives us those things. It's the very breath in our bodies that God has given to us to be able to give. And so easily that gets overlooked, right? Linda?
I think part of the problem that we have with giving, it goes back to control. They're not going to spend it the way I think they should.
Yeah.
And if you're just talking money.
Sure.
Or you feel like if you're giving time, you feel like, well, I've wasted my time doing this, trying to help that person or whatever. I think it comes down to control because we have that wonderful illusion that we have control.
Wonderful. It is a wonderful illusion sometimes, yeah. But you're exactly right. It's really, it boils down to pride, isn't it? We think we know better. We think we know the right way that is best. How can man understand his way? Kurt?
I think maybe that sometimes being involved with the poor, the needy, or the handicapped, whatever, gets us out of our comfort zone. And sometimes we are resistant of that, and I maybe just speaking of my own self.
Sure.
I remember when hardly anybody writes checks anymore. But when we did, Doris and I were retired teachers, we got paid once a month. So we write checks, and I heard a man talk about in a giving lesson, he says, so does the Lord get the first check that you write? Or does he get the one after you've paid all your bills and everything, get that check based on what you've got left? So it kind of made me think,
Yeah.
that's
an important thought to consider. Yeah, where does our first fruits go? You know, in the Bible, in the Old Testament especially, he talks a lot about the first fruits, right? And the first fruits were first stuff that's coming out of the ground, showing you what the produce is going to look like. He says, you give that to God. God expected them to give that to him. And do we think that same way? We give God our first and our best, and then everything else falls in line from there, or do we do that backwards? Something else you said made me think about Jesus. You know, we do get uncomfortable, I think, sometimes with people that are different than us, just period. I mean, take away the disadvantages and stuff. People that are different than us, we don't like being around them. And it was interesting to me, I've been noticing this as I've been reading through Matthew personally lately. Jesus intentionally went to the places where the people were, the disadvantaged people. He walked by the sea, and oftentimes his disciples would try to shelter him from those things, you know. And Jesus was kind of like, y'all leave me alone. This is what I ought to be doing. And he was trying to help us understand, you know, how not to show partiality. And sometimes it is getting uncomfortable. Sometimes it is putting us in positions where we perhaps don't know what giving looks like or serving looks like, but we're just there. And we let God take care of his business through us by making ourselves available in those ways. John?
Yeah, a lot of this discussion has caused me to look at verse 27 of chapter 20, where it says, the spirit of man is the lamp of the Lord, searching all the innermost parts of his being. You know, a lot of this has to do with our motives, with our attitude, with our spirit, you know. Are we conforming ourselves, you know, to the Spirit of God, or are we living in a material sense and trying to gather up more and put it in barns and, you know,
Build bigger barns
and make judgments on other people? Those are human. That's our human spirit. But we become more like Jesus. I think that verse helps me think about that.
Yeah, I appreciate it. And coming back to our verse, 19:17, whoever is generous to the poor lends to the Lord, and he will repay him. I think Kurt kind of tapped into this whenever God's promise is, you do this, I see it. And I'll repay you for that. God values this so much that he says, I'm going to ensure you have a reward for those kinds of things. You know, in this, tapping into Jesus' words in Matthew, the Sermon on the Mount, you know, things of true value. Set your mind on the things that are above. Don't store up treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal. Where your treasure is, that's where your heart's going to be also. Things like that. Did I see another hand, Jim?
It's definitely more blessed to give than to receive. Certainly it is. I'd rather receive than give, but it's definitely, in our lives, when we've given, we're more blessed. Definitely, many times we look at other people and we want them to give. And I don't know why we're that way. Here it's different. When somebody's here and there's really somebody in need, I have people come put money in my pockets and make sure it gets to them. It's such an interesting place. I've been in charge of that at every place I've ever been, and I've never been in a place that people are ready. They prepared, they've saved, they want to find opportunities to have somebody that really needs it, and there's no judgment. I'm going to make some judgments here. That's part of what I do, but in general, what a giving bunch of people is. And really, a long time ago, when somebody would come in the door, I would have people that came to get me because they wanted me to take care of it. Really, truly, this is calling us, right? It's calling me to do it, not somebody else, let me call somebody at the church. This is, when I have the opportunity, I should have prepared, and I should be the person that's helping.
Yeah. To your point, thank God that we're growing and learning in this grace. But I think the fact that we're having this conversation also speaks to our heart's tug away from it, right? We aren't naturally bent this way, are we? We come out into this world selfish as can be, screaming selfish, right? I got kids, I know about that right now. We're screaming selfish. And sometimes we don't outgrow that. Sometimes we continue to expect to be given and to receive and for others to do. And I think you made a really excellent point. The New Testament speaks to the personal responsibility each person has in regards to this. If anyone sees his brother in need and closes his heart to him, the love of God is not in him, 1 John would say. 1 John 3:18, I think, or 3:17. Again, this is a manifestation of God's Spirit, God's nature, that we need to grow in and we need to be instructed in. We ought to be givers. We ought to be givers to our very core. Miss Linda?
Yes, I was thinking about what Donna said, and if you look in Matthew 6, the one before, it tells you, not to give to be seen by others.
Sure.
And don't sound trumpet, and don't be like hypocrites, and don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that you're giving a secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you.
Yeah.
So we gotta be careful that we're not giving just to say, look how good I am.
Yeah. Even in our best stuff, Satan's still working on us, isn't he? I think he speaks to that in 1 Corinthians chapter 12 and 13, where he says, even if I give my body to be burned, if I give all that I have, but I have not love, I'm just a clanging cymbal, a noisy gong. I'm just making noise, right? How we go about doing it matters, yeah. And there's always a temptation there in our giving to do it to be seen by others. I think that's what Jesus speaks to there in Matthew chapter 6, for sure. Yeah, go ahead.
I think it's important to mention that there's other types of currencies.
Okay.
In Western civilization, with money obviously is opens doors for many people. But one way that I see that we're lacking in giving in our society is time.
Amen. Yeah.
Not taking the time I was looking for one, I couldn't pull one out of here. But not just taking the time to shine God's light through us to other people. Because I think is a real tragedy.
Yeah, we're so busy and we're so concerned with efficiency. It's a lot easier to throw physical currency than the intangible currency of our time towards people. And you're exactly right. And I think that's part of the reason you see this degeneration in society is because we don't know how to interact. We don't know how to give of ourselves. We don't know how to see people where they are looking there. And that maybe this is just a human issue, period.
People are craving it. I mean, one thing my atheist father noticed when I was visiting him in Washington is he said, "You ask everybody what their name is." And it really matters to people when you ask them their name. It makes them feel like a human being.
That's right.
It makes them feel like they're more than just who they are. And that's something that his dad, I really appreciate that about his dad, is that, he's somebody with a smile. And and that's just so important to people because they're craving that. And I mean, part of me feels like it might be because they have that big, Jesus hole in their heart. And
That's right.
They don't know. But
That's right.
I mean, we need to do that as Christians.
Yeah, great thoughts. Miss Linda, do you have another follow-up to that?
Well, I had another verse that jumped out at me.
Oh, we got 2 minutes. You sure you want to do this? Hey, let's do it.
Chapter 20, verse 10, it forces not to cheat others because it is actually an abomination to the Lord. And it says, unequal weights or unequal measures are both alike and abomination to the Lord.
Abomination to the Lord, yeah. And he says it again in verse 23. Almost the exact same thing. You think God cares about our honesty? Do you think he cares about how we handle our business? I've been keeping notes on what God has to say about how we handle business transactions and how we treat people. God cares about that. There's a lot of times I've observed in the business world where people say, well, that's just business. Y'all ever heard that phrase? That's just business. That's just how we do things. That's just baloney to God. I'm just saying there's no distinction for God. We act with integrity, we act with honesty, and that's what God expects. Just because other people in the world will let you get away with it and will even accept it, God will not. In fact, what word does he use there? It is an abomination to the Lord. You know how many times we've talked about that in Proverbs? You know what that means? That's not how it should be, and God hates it. He's going to say that in Proverbs chapter 6, which we're coming up on that in our Wednesday study. Things that are an abomination to the Lord, you need to be far, 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 far away from those things. And you need to recognize the foolishness of that and the danger of that and how much God hates it. He uses strong language about this on purpose because I think, especially in our capitalistic society, it's really easy to say, that's just how we do things. No, that's not how we do things. We listen to God. We let him dictate what is right and true. And we don't use unequal weights and unequal measures. Those are an abomination to the Lord. Yeah, great thoughts. Anybody else have a thought on that? Yeah, Danny?
That's how you can keep people poor, overcharging them.
Yeah. Oh, don't get me talking about our social state right now. All right. Well, guys, we got about a minute left. Let's, we got one more thought?
What she said is also reiterated exactly in 11:1. That
Yeah.
the balance is an abomination, so that's a third. I mean, that's three strikes right there.
If the Bible emphasizes it 3 times, we ought to be listening to it. Amen for that. Yeah, quick thought.
I think connecting these two threads that we talked a lot about today, and I was reflecting on the Sermon on the Plain, where Jesus said, "Blessed are the poor, the hungry, the weeping, the persecuted."
Yeah.
And I think the poor have a lot to offer.
That's right.
We talked earlier about our struggle with sin and our need for God. And sometimes the poor are just they know that posture of humility, and they're ready to receive God, whereas oftentimes the rich and the elite are not.
Yeah, we miss it sometimes in our pride. Yeah, great thoughts. All right, you guys, we'll move on to chapter 21 next week. Thank you for your thoughts.